Author Daniel Bergner talks about his new book, God of the Rodeo, which is about life inside Angola State Prison, located in Louisiana. The event takes place at a Barnes & Noble bookstore at Boston University. This discussion, which includes a question and answer session, lasts about 50 minutes.
Good evening. I would like to thank you all for coming out tonight in support of Daniel Bergner, as well as the Barnes & Noble at Boston University Author Series. Daniel Bergner is a New York-based journalist and author of the novel Moments of Favor. He is here tonight to discuss and sign his latest work, God of the Rodeo, The Search for Hope, Faith, and a 6-Second Ride in Louisiana's Angola Prison. This book grew from an assignment for Harper's Magazine into a hauntingly vivid account of Bergner's year inside Angola Prison. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Bergner.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Angola, Louisiana's maximum security penitentiary is a place that is beautiful, that defies credibility, that is terrifying, and that is in many ways otherworldly. It is a place that almost literally is a kind of parallel universe. I first went down there to cover the prison's inmate rodeo and thought I was just going down there to write a magazine article about that rodeo. It's an event that's billed by the prison as the wildest show in the South, an event that's advertised in the local papers promising inmates thrown every which way, as indeed these inmates are. They are untrained, they do not practice, and they are asked to ride 2,000-pound bulls, or in one of the more unique events, unique to Angola's rodeo that is, an event called convict poker. 4 inmates sit around a ramshackle but brightly painted red table that's placed in the middle of the rodeo ring. They sit there as though playing cards. There are no cards present. And a bull is released into the ring. And a professional rodeo clown hired for the day lures the bull to charge the backs of the sitting inmates. And the last inmate, either brave enough or crazy enough to remain sitting, is declared the winner. The rodeo, needless to say, results in frequent injury and often in very severe injury. Yet, it is an event for which the inmates volunteer eagerly. It's the one time all year, or I should say the 4 Sundays in October when the rodeo takes place, the one time all year when the public's invited onto the grounds, the public fills that 5,000-seat stadium, lines up along the road leading to Angola hours before the rodeo begins in order to guarantee them a seat. And knowing that the inmates volunteered so avidly to put themselves in such danger and to put themselves in such a troubling, degrading position before the public, what first brought me to Angola when I was just covering the rodeo was why these men put themselves in this position. Now, the answers to that are, of course, pretty complex, but I just thought I'd give you one quick example of one man who I wound up following through the year. This convict's name was Bucky Lassane, and about 17 years ago, he shot an 18-year-old boy through the back of the head, twice during a robbery, made that boy kneel, and then shot him twice as the boy pled for his life. Now, years later, Bucky's own son, who was an infant at the time of that robbery and that murder, never comes to visit him, visits at most once a year. And so Bucky takes part at great risk to himself. He has been knocked unconscious. He has had over 100 stitches to his scalp after one ramming by the bull, and has gone into seizure on the shower floor after another. Bucky takes part in the hope that he can win the silver-plated buckle that is the rodeo's main award for the all-around cowboy champion, and that by winning that he can prove himself worthy of his son's love and worthy of a visit. His son is now just about the same age as that boy that Bucky killed years ago. But two larger questions kept me at Angola after I'd seen the rodeo and spent a few weeks on the grounds. And those were these. The first had to do with the length of the sentences that these men are serving. They are serving, most of them, either life no parole or so many years that they might as well be serving that endless sentence. And in Louisiana, life really does mean life. There is no revolving door. There is no chance, really, of a gubernatorial pardon. None has been granted in the last 3 years. The governor will be reelected. That'll be 8. The next governor will have an awfully hard time turning back to any more forgiving agenda. So these men will never leave. 80% of the 5,000 inmates, it's estimated, will never leave Angola. And to think of that before I first went down there was almost to think I would rather die than spend forever in prison. And even short of that, it was to be almost incapable of imagining what daily life would be under such circumstances. It was to try to imagine and see only a void, or to try to imagine and hear the stereotypical cell door clanging shut and time ticking slowly, emptily by. Once I saw the way these men did live their lives, and that their lives were unexpectedly dramatic, and almost, and I use this word guardedly, rich in some cases, and a richness made out of almost nothing, I wanted very much to chronicle those lives and to fill up what had been for me an absolutely empty space. The other reason and the other question I wanted to answer, besides how these men construct their lives, was and had to do with Angola's warden, a man named Burl Cain, and a man who is as sort of great a presence as his name might indicate. He is a man who holds himself out as a prophet. He literally uses that word, of a penological revolution, a man who quotes from the Gospels on forgiveness and from the teachings of Attila the Hun on toughness, and a man who talks about making and saving lives in Angola. And remember, there's no carrot held out there for them, the inmates. They're not getting out. There's no promise of release for transformation. And yet, here was Burl Cain promising both rehabilitation and, because he felt his own mission was infused by religion, the salvation of these men's souls. And in these times, when, needless to say, rehabilitation is largely considered a mission for fools, I wanted to find out whether Warden Cain could possibly carry out this mission, meet those goals in any way, in a place so severe in its terms as Angola is. And then there was one last thing that I can't even call a question, that is almost inarticulable, but had to do with the physical beauty of Angola. It's a place that's larger than the island of Manhattan. It has no perimeter fence. It's bordered on 3 sides by a sweeping and sharp sort of turn of the Mississippi River, and on the 4th by some rising hills that are very thickly wooded. The terrain on the grounds itself is lots of farmland, a couple thousand cattle graze the fields, a couple of hundred horses, including some Mustangs on those fields. Beautiful bird life, blue herons taking off from a lake that occupies much of the center of the grounds. The place is intensely beautiful, so much so that there were times, just because of that beauty, when I didn't want to leave. And yet, of course, that set off against the tremendous destruction that pervades the air, the destruction of the victims' lives, and I think even more powerful than that, oddly enough, I mean, the victims are dead, is their families' lives that are so thoroughly destroyed, and then, of course, the inmates who've put themselves in this place, whose own lives are destroyed, and whose families, too, constantly feel that and will feel that forever. And that contrast left me feeling with something I can't really express any better than to rely on an old word, a sense of mystery, and questions about what possible greater order, beneficent direction, place for faith there could possibly be in a place that was so pervaded by sadness and by tragedy. Those things kept me there for the year, but I do want to circle back briefly for a moment and read a passage about the rodeo, which brought me down there at first and which framed some of those questions throughout the year. When I first went down there to cover the rodeo, I started by getting to know some of the men who would ride. One of them was a man named Johnny Brooks, who, although not allowed to practice, did do his own version of preparation. He had risen to the level of trustee, which means his disciplinary record within the prison was fairly good. And so he was allowed one of the choice jobs. And this will give you a certain sense of the drama and the movement that really is part of Angola's other world. He was one of the men in charge of the cattle, and so worked the range crew and actually got to ride horses, not bucking horses, and that's a whole different game. But he did get to ride horses, herd the cattle, rope and brand them and tag them and inoculate them, etc. And at the end of his workday, he would go into the saddle shed and he would place his horse saddle on a wooden rack about as high as, little shorter than this podium. And he would get into it and he would simply sit there on that saddle imagining what a bull might do. And this was the best he could do by way of preparation. He would do this every afternoon, and one day I followed him into that saddle shed, which is fairly lightless, and it was sort of a dusky level of light, and he put the saddle on the rack and leapt into it. And it seemed that he did that all but effortlessly. It seemed that he did that almost without bending his knees, that it was just a flick of his ankles that allowed him to rise up to that height and to get above the saddle. And so for a moment, it looked as though he were floating in that dusky air. And this, to me, was sort of an early hint of grace and skill that then I went back to the rodeo looking for on that first rodeo that I covered. Now, at that first rodeo, Johnny Brooks and everyone else was thrown as promised every which way. And a couple men were knocked unconscious, and one other man I wound up following through the year had his ribs broken and was coughing blood. So it did not work out, at least early on, that anyone attained that moment of grace that I'd seen earlier with Johnny Brooks. And then the afternoon wound down this way. In the afternoon's finale, The Guts and Glory, a red chip worth $100 was strung between a bull's horns. This was yet another inmate rodeo tradition. 30 convicts poured into the ring on foot, then tried to pluck the chip without being trampled or gored. And I was still searching for what I had glimpsed with Johnny Brooks in the saddle shed. Possibilities of exultation, hints of triumphant skill, of tremendous self-control in men who'd wound up here because they'd had little self-control at all. My eyes turned to Terry Hawkins, serving his life sentence for murdering his boss in an argument sparked by a demand that Terry work late on his stepdaughter's birthday. Already, his participation in the rodeo was a bad joke. The job had been in a slaughterhouse. He had hacked into his employer's head and neck with a meat axe. But Terry didn't see any strangeness or irony in his continued association with cattle. The Guts and Glory was his event. He planned to use his own well-tested strategy to beat the animal and snatch the chip. Goad the bull into charging, run away in an arc tighter than the bull could turn, and reach back behind his own shoulder to snag the prize. He had won the event several times in past years. Terry's learned the know-how, other inmates had told me with vicarious pride. Watch him. He had seemed, when we first met a month earlier, scarcely more than a teenager, though I knew he was in his mid-30s. 6'2" or 3", athletic, restless, he smiled both nervously and with bravado, slouched in a chair and jiggled his knees, appeared as naive and self-certain as the star of any high school team. He said his victories in the Guts and Glory were the best accomplishments of his life. I asked if that included the years before Angola. It did. I asked if he could imagine anything better in the future. He said no. I laid out a scenario, however far-fetched, in which he gained his freedom. Could he imagine any better accomplishment then? No. He showed me his cot, where he had written across the sheet and pillowcase in large, crude red letters, "Bullfighter." He told me, "I'm going to look for you in the stands. I'm going to toss you that chip when I get it." And ridiculing myself, both because this man was a murderer and because the contest was a gladiator show, I fantasized myself a part of his triumph, his happiness, a part of something that would be, however briefly, however sadly, however terribly, wonderful. Now an immense brown bull trotted into the ring. Wearing his good luck red wristbands and tattered red-ribbed t-shirt, Terry waited at the far end. He watched the commotion of other attempts. One man, rammed at the legs, was unable to stand or even drag himself away and lay in the mud while the horns prodded at his shins. Others climbed the fence as the bull lowered its neck and came at them. Terry studied the animal's moves. Then he emerged from the crowd, or rather, the other men backed away. He feinted, froze, wavered off balance, weight too far forward in the process of taunting. Paralyzed, he leaned 5 feet from the horns. But he steadied himself and lunged forward again, baiting, luring the bull, sprinting away along the sharpest curve. He reached behind. He was struck by the muzzle, caught between the horns. Terry flew 10 or 12 feet into the air. He landed, the only wonderful thing, between the horns again, was vaulted and flipped onto his back. He came down once more on the animal's forehead, was propelled upward yet again, floating and spinning, and for several seconds this went on, seconds I could count. 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000. His body for moments beyond gravity, suspended in midair, flopping and spineless, everything about his existence, the preservation of his life, utterly beyond his control. Now, though that rodeo, that first day, ended pretty bleakly, and though my relationship and my hopes for Warden Kane ended fairly despairingly as well, the year, in a strange way and in an unexpected way, as unexpected as I suppose the whole place of Angola really is, ended in some ways inspiritingly, upliftingly, despite the absolutely bleak circumstances that define that other world of Angola. But I thought I would stop there and answer any questions you might have about life inside Angola, specifically about larger prison issues, which I've become steeped in, about anything you might be curious about.
There was a great review of your book in the Sunday New York Times Book Review. One of the things that was raised in that review, though, was a question about the methodology you used in preparing your notes and so forth. Could you tell us something about how you recorded the conversations and so forth?
Sure. I should say first that what I wanted to do once I realized I was going to work on something that was book length rather than magazine length was, first of all, get thoroughly inside this world and immerse myself in it, and bring back something about a world that I think very, very few people know about because, and I'll come back to this later, it is so hard for reporters to get inside at all. But then, too, I wanted to be able to structure the book as a story. I didn't want to write a sociological prison book which would be read by a few, but wouldn't reach the kind of reader whose heart and mind, I suppose, I really wanted to touch in some way. Now, that left me with a kind of problem which the review raised, and that is that in some cases, now, for instance, Johnny Brooks, at that first rodeo, actually met a woman through the chain link of the rodeo fence whom he struck up a very brief conversation with. Neither of them are people of many words, and they are also not, well, Johnny Brooks is all but illiterate. But they struck up this very tenuous romance of occasional phone calls, whatever they could afford, occasional letters, whatever they could manage to write, and occasional visits, again, in whatever transportation they could manage. And I wanted very much to document this romance. Johnny Brooks hoped he would get married to Belva by the end of the year in an Angola wedding. So there were moments when I was faced with a choice. I could either do what the Daily Reporter would do, which was simply report what I witnessed sort of firsthand, that is what I had on the tape recorder, and I wound up with hundreds of hours on the tape recorder. But I really wanted to be able to capture some of those conversations. So what I would do was quiz Johnny Brooks over and over and over about what he would say in the phone conversation, go to Belva, quiz her, and just use my ear to wait for the sound of authenticity in what they were reporting to me, and then go back and double and triple check it, so that I think the reporting methodology was sound, very sound, and somewhat tirelessly got, but I did make a decision to try to reconstruct the scene as best I could, so that there would be a reason to turn the page, besides the sociological interest, that there would just be the narrative interest of wanting to know what happened next.
How much did this experience change you?
Well, it changed me a lot in a sort of nuanced way, if that's not a complete contradiction. I saw, as my hope in Warden Kane fell away, and I should stop here to say a little bit about that. He maintained, as I've said, that he was setting up all these rehabilitative programs, and that was what his mission was about. I began to see and hear rumblings of a much darker side of him about a third or two-fifths of the way into the year. And as he sensed that I wasn't going to portray exactly what he'd wanted, and what he has in fact gotten from the national TV media in the past, he began to try to get me to give him editorial control over what I wrote. He then followed that up, alas, with a demand that I actually pay him personally for my continued access to what he felt was his prison. And then after that, of course, he really wanted an editorial agreement, and so said, you either sign this thing that's going to give me control over what you write and control over your notes, or you're leaving. I left, or I was left. I was shown to the gate and had to sue in federal court in order to get back in. So my year kind of took a dive emotionally, because I really had, however naively, put some faith in him. However, what that was replaced by, slowly, was seeing what the inmates were able to do out of nothing, and that was never to forget what they had done to put themselves there. Bucky's crime that I mentioned earlier, 2 shots to the back of the head, was actually one of the cleaner murders. They're not always that clean. They're pretty heinous things done by hand and stick and knife. So I always remembered that, spent time with the victims, and yet could not help rooting for what I saw, which was a kind of step-by-step progress that many of the men, after years and years in Angola, were able to make. So sort of as the hope for the miracle worker fell away, maybe a different kind of transcendence or a different kind of revelation of what's inside human beings sort of took the place of that larger, more dramatic hope.
I wondered if you could comment on the kind of sentencing in Angola or Louisiana, if you can compare that to, say, Massachusetts or New York, please.
Sure. Louisiana in the mid-70s was a kind of pioneer in the life no parole sentence, and the state still ranks as one of the top 3 in meting out that absolutely endless sentence. However, it's a sentence that is being used more and more often across the country, so that between 1992 and 1997, the last year for which statistics are available, there's been about a 65% jump across the country in the use of that sentence that allows for no possibility of parole. And it's troubling. I cannot stand here and say it is absolutely, positively unjust to spend time with the victims or to think about how I would feel were my own 6-year-old daughter who was murdered, is to acknowledge that at best I would want life no parole. And sometimes I stood there with Bucky and I thought, you should be dead. Why are you alive here telling me your tale when you killed someone else's teenage son? On the other hand, just to give you one other example, to follow through the year a man named Danny Fabry, who was one of the more heinous killers that I followed, who started the year with a 4th grade reading level and edged that up to 7th, and who entered a group called the Toastmasters group. I'll have to explain that. Toastmasters exists all over the world, and it's sort of a public speaking group. Angola has its own chapter, and it's inmate run, and so once a week the inmates gather and 2 or 3 or 4 of them will give a speech. And they're scored in the following way. There's an inmate counter, and he counts on a little legal pad whether you say you know, well, etc. I will say a few of those, if not more, before we're done. But the winner is the man who says the fewest of those, and the loser wears for the remainder of the meeting a 3-foot-tall pink-painted dunce cap. Now, the fact that this went on in prison at all, in a maximum security prison, remember 85% of these guys are murderers, rapists, and armed robbers, the fact this went on at all amazed me. But to follow Danny as he tried to get out from under that hat, which he wore pretty often, and to deliver some form of coherent self-expression was to be very moved about human possibility. And I should just flash back and say that when on trial, Danny was so volatile that his feet were not only shackled together, they were chained to the courtroom floor. So at the very least, it was a lesson in what people are capable of when they really want to transform themselves.
Were there ever times that you felt in danger while you were interviewing these inmates?
I guess it would make a much more dramatic story if I could say yes. I really wasn't. The times I felt some trepidation, after this sort of showdown with the warden in federal court, I didn't know what I was going back in to meet. I didn't know what the warden would do. I was warned he's very vindictive. He had a long history before the extortion attempt with me, it turned out, of profiteering off inmate labor. Some of that publicly reported, lots of it legally traceable on paper. And I really worried about all kinds of vindictiveness there. But amazingly enough, the people I worried about most, meeting that vengeance out, that is the guards, who were his employees, were actually quite thrilled that I'd taken the warden on in this unlikely way. They actually felt as besieged by him, it turned out, as the inmates do, and could not have been happier. And so in subtle asides constantly for the next months would quote to me from the bits of the lawsuit that had been reported in the press. Because, you know, I mean, when you're running a corrupt operation, literally, I mean, this is a fiefdom. I mean, really, it's 18,000 acres, it's 5,000 inmates, it's another 1,800 employees who are underpaid and don't have a whole lot of other options. You know, you run that corrupt operation to protect yourself, and what happens as a result is not just the inmates, but the employees aren't dealt with particularly fairly. So, no, after that, after those first few days back when I realized I had more or less 1,800 employees at my defense, I felt fine.
Have any of the inmates read the book? I'm sure you've heard from some of them.
I have. I've getting a book into prison is a little bit of a task, but I have sent it down. They have at least read the Harper's article that preceded it. And there's been a mix of reactions. I think that they see that my effort was to present them as human beings, however flawed their stories are. Some of them have reacted negatively, a few, I should just say, because they're used to, when the press comes, getting the sort of abstract treatment of their crime, that is, he's in for murder 1 or he's in for murder 2. And to have it laid out as I have laid it out does alarm them. But I felt like I really had no choice there. If I was going to look for the humanity, and if I was going to try to document the stories that actually move towards something positive, I couldn't possibly leave out the other side. It would be completely morally imbalanced and just wouldn't represent the complexity of the situation and of all the questions that I constantly had to ask myself throughout the year. So even those recognize why I included them, but there were certainly some objections raised to that.
Did many of the inmates express remorse over the things they had done, or?
Yeah, again, there was a complex range, but I'll tell you about one inmate I followed through the year, and that's Terry Hawkins, whose efforts in the Guts and Glory so often ended in him being spun around and sometimes actually literally tossed into the stands, or ribs broken, etc. Terry actually felt haunted, I don't think that's an over or melodramatic statement, by that crime where he axed his boss to death, literally axed right through pretty much his neck. He liked his boss, felt somewhat indebted to his boss, and still to this day does not know. He knows he's a person prone to violent anger, but sort of doesn't know where that degree of violent anger came from on that night, and so is still constantly haunted by it. And during the beginning of the year I spent there, he began to be involved in the church services of a visiting faith healer. And this visiting faith healer came and literally had a room of convicts, just one guard present, but a room larger than this one, filled with convicts talking in tongues and wandering around the room and holding arms up in some kind of communion with God, though the ceiling was exactly this exalted type of pressboard ceiling. And Terry waited to be inspired or to feel Jesus come into him so that he might be brought to talk in tongues. And he never felt, in his own words, qualified. He said, "There's too much devil in me." And so while this minister was holding out a doctrine of free grace and saying, Jesus will love you no matter what, it's the sin, not the sinner, etc., and was saying Jesus' love is available to you all, Terry was saying to himself, no, it's not available to me. So there was tremendous remorse there, and remorse that really carried right through all the time I spent with him, so that still, toward the end of the year, and you've got to picture, most of the men in Angola don't live in cells, they live in 60-man dorms, even though, again, they're the most violent offenders. They're all in 60-man dorms, sort of like you might picture an old TB ward, just metal bed after metal bed. And he would get down on his knees every night and pray, or he would underline. He, too, wasn't very literate, and I don't know how he got through what he did of his King James Bible, but he would take a little highlighter and sort of underline passages. So though he did that, he never did feel like he was worthy of that salvation that was offered. So to follow him through the year was, yes, definitely to see someone full of remorse, but, surviving in whatever way he could, knowing he wasn't getting out.
Was that the first, very violent thing that he had done, or had there been other signs?
No, he'd been in prison before for armed robbery for a brief time, and though many of the men protest this was really my first offense, the truth is, when you go back and look at the court documents, it's not. It might be their first adult offense. They have long juvenile records, and the juvenile prison system, needless to say, is not great, and is often more violent than the adult one. So no, they'd generally been through several cycles and plenty of warnings. There are no real excuses for the past, I think, for most of them. Just stories forward. And I should add, some of them do, of course, do the stereotypical thing and deny their crimes. You know, maintain their innocence. Though it's hard to believe that that high a percentage of men really are innocent.
I am curious with regards to that greater social aspect and the effect that your writing and your presence has had on the whole penal system. Any allies with regards to your perspective and the exploitation of the convicts and what Cain has done? Granted, he's not the only one in the world that does this, but what effect, if any, have you seen, or what hope is there?
I'd say almost no effect. I don't know how much hope. I'll give you an example just in regard to Angola and then make a more general comment. After the Harper's article that I did came out, which touched on some of these things, the state legislature there actually called hearings, and Cain and I testified not only on the same day, but actually as a microphone broke, we were sort of shoulder to shoulder, sharing the same microphone. And the chairman of the committee, at least, had done his own homework by that point and had gotten enough corroboration that he really felt like the portrait I was painting was pretty accurate. And he went out and he tried to get either the few inmates with a long enough good time record to have some credibility with the, of course, skeptical public, or to get some of the employees to come down and testify. And absolutely no one would. Zero. The reason being, for the inmates, even if there weren't physical retribution, any little thing taken away when you already have nothing is everything. You know, to take away the trustee ranking is as though your house were taken away. And for the employees, of course, to be reassigned means everything as well, when they too already really have so little. I mean, just to give you a sense, it's a starting salary of $13,000 a year. And not to sidetrack too much onto their predicament, but when they work in a dorm, they're locked inside the dorm. One guard, 60 men, locked inside the dorm. The door is locked from the outside, and if there's any violence that goes on, they get to press a button. Now, the button does not activate a walkie-talkie. There's no verbal communication. It just activates an alarm. And they're guaranteed to have someone come within 3 minutes. Now, if we started counting 3 minutes, you know, the reality of 3 minutes is awfully long. And not only that, but the key guard on the outside who patrols the whole series of dorms is mandated not to open the door until help arrives as a violence containment measure. So you could be banging on that door. You're not going anywhere. So it's a tough job, and they, you know, they don't want to be jeopardized by coming out against their warden either, though, as I say, you know, many of them have spoken to me. Some have actually been so bold as, you know, when I was in Louisiana, to call in on phone shows and talk anonymously. In any case, the hearings were held, the cameras rolled, the local media was there. No, nothing's had an effect. Warden Cain is in power and will remain in power. And I think partly that's just an indication of where we are generally. We don't just lock them up, justified, throw away the key, maybe justified, but completely turn our backs, which I think is completely untenable morally. I mean, maybe just to put it in this perspective, wardens are God. As close as there can be to an earthly God, a warden is it. He has absolute control over these men. And we, in hiring that warden, have, in a sense, the same control. Now, what we would want from a God, whether we believe in one or disbelieve or don't know, but what we would at least in our more hopeful modes, would want is, of course, someone, some force, something watching over. Ironically enough, in the moment that we take on that role here, we do exactly the reverse and don't do any watching over. We turn our backs.
Isn't Louisiana like a pretty corrupt state?
People would say to me, and I think it's partly true, it's just Louisiana, what can you do?
They have a whole different legal system. I mean, they do. I think it's like based on the French legal system as opposed to the English common law. Louisiana is not like the rest of the United States.
I wouldn't accredit to the libertine French history, but it is true that does seem to be a little more tolerance of corruption in Louisiana than elsewhere. Warden Kane's actually been tied to the past governor, Edwards, who's up on his third racketeering trial now. So yes, you're right. Nevertheless, it's a beautiful state, and still in all, Warden Kane's level of corruption, the public notice it's gotten, at least down there, is so extraordinary. It does defy logic that he would be allowed to stay in. You'd think that any governor would just want to be rid of him, rid of the headache. But it seems that it's more politically troubling even to put your little pinky as a politician near the whole issue of criminal justice, that's more a problem than just leaving him up there and the public's going to forget about him and let him run the show as he wants to run it. It is pretty incredible, and he's a pretty incredible man. The first rodeo, when he took over Angola, he actually decided to enter the grounds. They have an opening procession. He decided to enter the grounds on a horse-drawn chariot. And not just a horse-drawn chariot, but he decided to rig up his own inmate-tended team of Percheron horses. These are a special kind of horse that's about twice the size of a normal horse. His are jet black, and he dudded them up in these chrome medallions and entered in this grand Roman fashion. When I first met him and he was talking so strongly about rehabilitation, I thought, well, okay, this is a wildly outsized ego, but maybe it would take such an ego to actually turn men who've fallen so low around. I think the lesson maybe is that a little less ego would go a lot farther. Yeah.
Do you have any idea how the prison population there is divided along racial lines? And
Yeah, it's about 80% black, 20% white. The guard force, by contrast, is about 2/3 white, 1/3 black. And that does have an effect. I had to be really careful, though, when going down there not to be the sanctimonious northerner looking for the racial troubles in the South. And so I just want to preface this by saying I've been to other prisons. I've been to prisons in the North. There are serious racial problems throughout the prison system and probably, in the next step back, and of course in the criminal justice system as a whole. That said, at Angola, things have a pretty dramatic way of coming to the surface. For instance, when the rodeo first started, about 30 years ago, right after the Star-Spangled Banner, they would play Dixie, and a wooden platform with the graphic of the Confederate flag was laid in the middle of the ring, and an elderly black inmate dressed up in a Confederate soldier's uniform was pretty well forced, this wasn't so volunteer, to tap dance for the crowd. So you can kind of get a picture of the tradition. Still, this year, right now, this weekend, the opening procession of the rodeo will include the Confederate flag being brought in, and the Confederate flag will, in addition, fly over Angola Stadium. So there isn't a great deal of racial sensitivity.
Have you had any interest, dare I say it, from the film industry?
Dare you say it?
As if you hadn't.
I only hope at this point. And I should just say, just veering back to your question about it's just Louisiana, there were people I found down there who worked in the prison who did have real integrity. I mean, 2 past wardens had really done kind of heroic jobs. They're far more conservative than I would place myself. But I really wound up the year having great respect for them, great respect for the transformation they'd brought to the prison, which was wildly violent in the 70s, hundreds of stabbings a year. And these men were able to turn that around and able to bring a certain amount of trust on the inmates' part to the administration. And one of the sadnesses of the year was just watching Keynes squander that. I mean, there was a chance, if not for miracles, for moving things 10% in the right direction. I think pretty tragically, he's completely failed to do that. I guess I'll just add one note, and then if you do have any more questions, be glad to answer them. And that is, that will circle back to religion. Now, of course, religion is an easily manipulable thing for inmates. They may use it and do use it as a way to cling to their imagined, really, thread of hope that they will ever get out. But for some of them, it was a really sincere and serious effort, as it was, too, for some of the chaplains at Angola. And so one of the really moving things to watch on a place called Angola's Camp J, which is where the worst of the worst disciplinary cases are sent, the men who are stab in Angola or rape or do things, I suppose, even more grotesque than that, and maybe too grotesque to go into right here. Those men are sent there. It's a kind of cracked concrete world of absolutely no air and little light. So little air, really, that to stand there in the 95, when it's 95 degrees outside, and just to stand absolutely still to do an interview was to be drenched in sweat. And the inmates actually pour water on their concrete floor and lie down in the puddle of water to stay cool. But entering this other world, or other world within Angola's other world, where the men, again, in their isolation, often slash themselves with cracked off razor blades they get from their disposable razors, or smear themselves sometimes with their own excrement, was this chaplain assigned to this one dungeon. And every day, he would load up his A&P-like shopping cart with a bunch of inspirational literature, and he would yell out, "Gate," and the guard would slowly get up and open the gate, and down the tier would go Chaplain Holloway with this shopping cart, asking if the inmates wanted anything to read. And often they requested the King James Bible, thinking that, or apparently believing that if they just had the right language, as opposed to the modern language, they would find the secret to something more positive in their lives. But he would push the shopping cart and distribute this literature, and then he would ask the inmates if they wanted to pray, and some of them would accept this offer, and he would tip his head forward through the bars, and they would tip theirs through the bars, and with their foreheads touching and holding hands, they would pray that this inmate would have at least the strength to re-enter what's called the general population. And he would do this day after day after day. This is his entire life. To watch that was, again, to be inspired by something that is possible within us. Similarly, to watch one of the men who had spent 15 years basically on that tier, who by his own declaration, in his own words, had lived the life of a savage in Angola, but who was lucky enough to only have a 15-year sentence. And to watch him, to follow him as he left Angola and tried to go almost directly from that savagery. And again, he was one of those who did things too grotesque to go into here, as well as all the stereotypical prison violence. To watch him go straight from that and try to make a life for himself in the outside, in society, was also to watch a kind of struggle that was a reminder of shared humanity, and that was a reminder of just what is within all of us. This is the dangerous territory I often hesitate to go into, because I think people shut down and think, I absolutely am not them. They are those guys in stripes out there in the rodeo, too crazy and too stupid to know better, and so violent that they've put themselves there. And yes, they have been and are often incredibly violent. But I do think we all exist along that spectrum, and to watch this man, Littell, try to make that transition was again to be reminded of something humbling and something very human, and was also finally to watch a really, really compelling story unfold as I followed him back to the city of his crime and back to where he was going to try to make a life for himself. Again, I'd be happy to answer anything else.
I do have one more question, and it's back to the chaplains and Kane. And what is your understanding of, you just cited the instance of the chaplain who was being a chaplain daily to these people in Camp J. How do you understand the chaplains that say, praise God, Kane, and really bought or buy his way? It's such a contradiction.
You mean, how do I understand?
How do you understand they're coping with him and supporting it? I mean, it seems from the reading that they go along with him.
I think they have to go along, right, or they'd be out. But maybe this visiting faith healer who was trying to inspire Terry Hawkins said it best. I asked her about the inmates. Don't you worry, these guys are just toying with you. Don't you worry, they're even just coming to services for an hour out of the dorm. And she said, no, I can't worry for two reasons. One, people in the outside world, in what the inmates called the free world, use church for all kinds of reasons, or use the temple for all kinds of reasons. Here it's just the same, some sincere and some manipulative. I just hope that in that moment, and believe that in that moment, she said, that I'm dealing with them, they're sincere, what they do afterward, I can't say. And so I suppose it's the same for those chaplains who are sincere. They recognize that there are those who will use religion in completely twisted ways, as Kane does, but that doesn't change the work that they feel compelled to do.
During this time that you were there, were you staying nearby and going to the prison every day? And did you get a sense, even a little bit, of what their lives were really like on the hourly, daily basis from sunrise to sunset?
Yeah, I would stay more than from sunrise to sunset. I did always check out, finally, at the very end of the day, but the end of the day often meant midnight. So I think I really did. I tried to do absolutely everything with them. Part of the court case was ensuring that I could do that without any prison employee at my side, so that I was literally went out onto the grounds, found the inmate I wanted to follow, and I finally narrowed it down to 7 that I would chronicle through the year, and spent day after day after day with them, so that when I wanted to follow Johnny Brooks through his day, I had to learn, alas, to ride a horse. Being from New York City, I was not much of a horseman, so I had to rely on an inmate, 275 inmate named Bear, to teach me to ride a horse. I never became too skilled at it, and they always put me on a horse named Missy, while theirs were all had studly names, and I still didn't control Missy very well, but I was able to stick by Johnny Brooks as I stuck by the others to really get as close as I could. Of course, I got to leave, they didn't, and that's the final divide, but I spent an awful lot of time.
I'd just like to say that Mr. Bergner will be signing his book across the hall if you'd like to have it signed, and it is 20% off tonight, I should mention. And thank you very much again.
Thank you all.
rodeo where inmates are participants is held annually every Sunday in October at Angola State Prison, located in Louisiana.